Hi, my name's Robin, and I'm a therapist in private practice. And I thought I would reflect on my favorite books of 2025. Um, and actually, 2025 was the year that I got back into reading after a really long hiatus of around 8 years, at which was spent raising kids. So I have a 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. And what I noticed was that I was really yearning, I guess, to be enveloped in a really good book, to really step away from short form content and start falling in love with books again. So my intention for last year was to consume any genre, any format of book. I sort of noticed that for quite a long time, I rarely allowed myself the privilege of reading anything that wasn't like a non-fiction heavy book that was going to support me or support my clients. So I finally just went, you know what, I give myself permission to read for pleasure again. And it really opened up my world, going from completing probably 5 books in 2024. I managed to read 56 books in 2025. And it was also the year that I introduced myself or got introduced to audiobooks. I'd sort of dismissed in the past as not being the right way to delve into a book, but actually it was perfect. It meant I could go for my walk and listen to the book, or when I was on the tube or even doing housework, it really opened up my world. So, in terms of how I consumed books last year, it was either a physical book, my Kindle, something that I cannot live without now, and I really resisted purchasing for a really, really long time. I got my Kindle 3 years ago, so super late to the game, but absolutely love it now and just take it with me everywhere. And then also on audiobooks, and that was through Audible and Spotify. So, a caveat that my list of books are not arranged in a hierarchy. I just literally went through the list of books that I've either read or listened to and extracted the 10 that I enjoyed the most or they had a lasting impact on me. So let's start with number one, which is My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menachem and was published in 2017. I have to say that this book doesn't just ask you to think differently, but also to really feel differently. And it's more than a book about race, it's a book about the body. It's about all of the history that's living inside of us. And it's about healing ourselves is not separate from healing our society. Even if we just stay with the title, My Grandmother's Hands, that feels really powerful for me. For me, it reminds me that what we carry in our bodies did not begin with us. It's our fears, our tensions, our survival strategies, and even our silences. They can be inherited. The research at the moment on intergenerational trauma and epigenetics has demonstrated that trauma is passed down through generations. It's not only through the stories that we're told, but through our nervous system. And the author shows us that racism is political construct. It's not just an idea in the mind, it's something that also lives in the body and it shows up as contraction, fear, aggression, and disconnection. One of the themes of the book that is still with me is that racism is embodied. We're so used to talking about racism as a moral issue or a political issue, but the author asks us to also see it as a biological and emotional one. Our bodies learn how to react to danger over time, and then what can happen is that entire communities learn these reactions. And what he's saying is that healing racism is not only about changing laws or language, it's all about learning how to settle our bodies, how to breathe, how to stay present, and how to build safety inside ourselves. And I know that so much around us doesn't feel safe. it can be really hard or difficult or challenging to find that safety. But it's such a great book, and there's exercises in there. So yeah, I definitely recommend if you would just like to delve a little bit further into understanding race and understanding the ways that our bodies move through the world when it's played through this construct. So that was number one. So number two is The Interpreter of Maladies by Jahumpa Lahiri. Hope I'm saying that correctly. And that was published in 1999. So this book, it's a collection of short stories, and I just devoured them. So in terms of the books, they capture each of the stories, delve into the stories of either Indian nationals living in India or immigrants of Indian ethnicity, and also won a Pulitzer. And yeah, what can I say about this book? I finished it in 2 days. It was such an easy read. I didn't want to put it down, and I also just wanted to savor each of the stories. It felt like a little vignette into a life. It's almost like we were dropped into a moment, often a really quiet, ordinary moment. There wasn't a lot going on in that short story necessarily. There wasn't anything dramatic or big conclusions necessarily. We were just asked simply to be with the characters, to witness a moment in their life. But those moments, they stayed with me, and what moved me is how much these moments resemble our own lives. We all have these small, seemingly insignificant experiences that shape us. It could be a conversation that lingers, a misunderstanding that changes a relationship, a silence that can say more than words. And the author captures those moments, I found, with such care. The stories range from loss, navigating relationships, the excitement as well as the hardship of moving to a new country. So definitely something I would like to explore more of in terms of short stories this coming year. I'm excited about that. So if we now move on to the third book, which is The Catcher in the Rye. And this was published in 1951 by J.D. Salinger. And I actually read this book for the first time when I was 18. Absolutely loved it. It was my favorite book for such a long time. I also revisited it in my late 20s. It felt slightly different, but I still remember loving it and adoring it. And then I decided that I would read it again at 41, and it feels really different once more. It's the only book that I've read 3 times, and I guess for me, I really wanted to recapture what I felt when I was younger, but also I wanted to see if it was still one of my favorite reads, because we change, and then so our relationship with the stories will change too. So, in terms of the book itself, the main protagonist is called Holden Caulfield. When I was 18, felt almost like a mirror. Even though our social worlds were so different, his sense of making meaning of the world at such a young age sort of resonated with me. His anger made sense, his sarcasm, it felt honest. And then journeying with him as he left school and went around New York, reflecting on his past, it really seemed to resonate with myself at that age, being on the periphery of becoming an adult, going to university, living away from home for the first time. There's this rebelliousness in me, this constriction, but also this confusion. He seemed like he was seeing the world through a lens that others were closed off from, or potentially not having that in a dialogue, which seemed to, for me, it seemed to sort of encompass angst and loneliness. There was desire there, felt really separate from the adults around me. And then in my late 20s, my reading shifted, and the main protagonist, he no longer felt like a hero. He felt like someone in pain. And I still understood his frustration, but I noticed how lonely he was now, um, how lost and how desperately he wanted connection, but didn't really know how to ask for it. So for me, the book stopped being about rebellion and I could see it through a lens of vulnerability. So now at 41, again, my relationship with the book has changed. Holden feels so much younger than he did. And this time, I almost notice his fear a little bit more. There's a lot more grief that was present when I was reading the book. I was also noticing that I was seeing it through the lens of being a mother. When he spoke about his siblings, there was a different activation in me. So that famous fantasy of being the catcher in the rye now felt more heartbreaking, but also beautiful at the same time. You know, a child who wants to save others from falling because he himself is terrified of falling. So for me, I think this is why, reading books matter. They allow us to be able to express maybe what's going on for us in a moment in time. Words aren't always to articulate words ourselves aren't always accessible, but to read it through somebody else's writings can be really profound. So yes, so that was I think it was the third book, wasn't it? Yes, my third book. So let's talk about my fourth book. So the fourth book is The Myth of Normal, which is written by Gabor Mate and published in 2024. So I completed the Compassionate Inquiry course, which is co-created by Gabor and Satnaram Kaur, and I completed that. It finished Feb last year. So for me, it felt like a really nice way to re-engage with his work shortly after completing that course. And much like the course itself, book felt less like reading a book and, more like having a language to things I'd already been sensing. So both personally and professionally when I'm working with clients. Um, and the title itself feels quite radical. The myth of normal. It challenges the idea that our society is healthy and that those who struggle are somehow abnormal. Mate suggests that actually, in a culture where there is so much disconnection, there's trauma, so much pressure, anxiety, depression's increasing, addiction. I'm seeing a lot of clients coming in with signs of burnout, a sense of failure individually, but actually to really understand the responses to all of this is to understand what is an unhealthy world. And actually, these are signs of not individual failure, but a response to an unhealthy world. I really like how it links the personal and the political, the psychological and the social, as well as the body and the mind. Trauma is not viewed as something rare or extreme. The book describes how widespread, often subtle, and deeply embodied it is. And Gabor writes about how trauma it's not just what happened to us, it's what happened inside when we didn't have the support we needed. I think I'll just stay with that for a moment. I saw elements of my own compassionate inquiry course throughout the book. The invitation is always the same, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And then what did you have to adapt to in order to survive? And stay with that for a moment because it dissolves shame. It opens up curiosity and it allows for dignity. And in my work as a psychotherapist, the perspective feels essential. So often people come into therapy believing that they are broken, and this book reminds us that they are not broken. They are adapted. Their systems make sense. Their coping strategies were actually intelligent responses to environments that were overwhelming, unsafe, or emotionally absent. And the book makes it impossible to separate individual healing from collective responsibility. And again, I think that's really important. We can't treat trauma while ignoring the systems that continue to generate it. whether that's poverty, racism, gender oppression, colonialization, and disconnection from nature. They're not side issues. They are central to mental and physical health. And for me, this book validates the way that I work with my clients. And for me, this book really validates a way of working that is slower, softer, and more embodied. Okay, so number 5 is Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici, and that was published in 2004. I say it's not an easy book, it's not going to comfort you and it's not gentle, but it was one of the most profound books that I feel like I've read in a while because it really changed the way I understand power, history, and who suffering is considered normal. The author asks us to rethink the story of modern society. So for me, I was taught that capitalism, progress, modernity, they're inevitable and they're beneficial. And what this book does, it shows that they were built through violence against women, against the poor, against indigenous populations, and against the body itself. The book really talks about the witch hunts that have taken place globally throughout history, that they're not random acts of superstition, the way we're made to believe, that they were actually very political. They were controlled. They were about breaking communal bonds, disciplining bodies, especially women's bodies, into obedience. Just wow. And that's how I felt. When I was reading it, I felt like, wow. Every chapter, I just be like, wow, wow. Reading this book felt liberating, but also really scary because in many ways I can see they still feel so relevant today. They connected things I had a snippet of awareness around, the way that women's labour is devalued, the way care work is invisible, the way poverty is criminalised, and the way that our bodies are controlled in the name of order and productivity. And the author shows us that the witch was not just a historical figure, she's also a symbol of resistance and autonomy and community knowledge that had to be destroyed for a new economic system to survive. And if we relate it to our current political climate, the book feels really, really, for me anyway, felt really relevant to this moment. To reflect on what's happening around the world, we can see this happening. We can see this renewed attempt to control bodies, whether that's through reproductive rights, through the policing of gender and sexuality. There's the criminalisation of poverty and protest. We're seeing fear being used as a political tool again. And I think once you've read this book, you can't necessarily unsee these patterns repeating themselves. Power still works, but by deciding whose lives are disposable and whose labour is exploitable. I recommend this book to everyone who'd really like to understand the political landscape and maybe the history that's led to where we are now. So it's still staying with me, this book, and it's changing how I see the world. Okay, so the 6th book on my list is a memoir called Easy Beauty by Chloe Cooper Jones, and it was published in 2022. So the author, to give some background context, she was born with a rare congenital condition which impacts her height and it also causes her to walk with a gait. In terms of this book, this is a little bit of what the author said in her own words. It really summed up so much of the book for me. So this is what the author said in her own words about the title, and I thought I'd share it here. So the title comes from a philosopher who I talk about in the book. He had this distinction between easy and difficult beauty, but he wasn't putting a value judgment on one over the other. Easy beauty is the kind of beauty we recognize in the world, often very quickly. It can come to us when we're looking at a flower or a sunset or listening to a simple spatial rhythm. It's the kind that our senses arise at and recognize easily and seamlessly. And I think a lot of our greatest joys come from easy beauty, but there's also difficult beauty. It's the kind that might be a little harder to recognize and that requires a little additional education or patience or willingness to sit through the complexity. Maybe you're listening to a difficult piece of music and not knowing what you're hearing at first, but give it time, patience, or learn about it, and it reveals itself in bits and pieces as being a complex and exciting and beautiful. And the book is engaging in both of these kinds of beauty. And it really does. Easy beauty explores art, disability, human value, how we learn to recognize beauty. Chloe asks us to question what we instinctively see as beautiful and who is excluded from that definition. Age, body shapes, um, skin tones, etc. So yeah, I found that she was really able to express this through the lens of disability. So in society, disabled bodies are often treated as difficult, not because they lack beauty or value, but because society has not learned how to see them. What if we were willing to apply the same curiosity and patience to bodies that we apply to art? What would that mean? And I love reflecting on that question. And I really took to exploring that for myself in a wider perspective, but also my relationship with my body. Society would deem um, me at 41 to no longer have beauty or value because of my age as a woman over 40. I think for me, this book really challenges that notion. And I love the idea of easy beauty and hard beauty and all of it being beautiful. So, number 7, which is also a memoir. This one is by Glynis McNichol, and it's called I'm Mostly Here to Enjoy Myself, and it was published in 2024. And it's about pleasure, all kinds of pleasure experienced by the author during her time spent in Paris during the summer of 2021, after over a year spent in lockdown in New York. Glynis, I think she was 46, mid 40s, 46, 47, decided to go visit Paris, a city that she's very comfortable with and has friends in, and just feel pleasure and touch and community again. And this book for me was an absolute pleasure to read. I really loved witnessing a woman in her late 40s taking up space, living a life that's in contrast to the script that society allows for women of a certain age to inhabit. And even now, so much of the path through life, women are assigned is much the same as it always has been. Be desirable, get married, have kids, be pleasing, remain silent. And really, for me, this book was in contrast to all of that. We see the author enjoying her life, but not through rose-tinted glasses or editing what's captured on the pages, but by really asking herself what she desires, what brings her joy, and then giving it to herself without shame and guilt. And I want more of us to be able to do that. Like, ask yourself constantly, what do I desire? And then give it to yourself. And again, without shame and guilt. I I love those small moments in life that can bring us so much joy. And for me, this book really encapsulates what women over 40 can be. We can be magnetic and powerful and joyful. I feel these things so much more than I did when I was younger. I feel so expansive in this decade, and I'm truly excited, to continue aging and having fun. And I really admired Glynis's honesty and humour. The book felt a little bit like curling up with a glass of wine and your best friends, and just having the most wonderful conversations where you truly see each other. And it's such a gift, isn't it, to be seen in all of your messiness, your vulnerability, your fears. Okay, so number 8. So number 8 is White Teeth. by Zadie Smith, and it was published in 2000. This has actually been on my reading list, probably since it was first published, which is over 2 decades ago. And I think Zadie Smith was in her early 20s when this was published. And I'm just like, wow, it's such an incredible book. And I think for me, I probably put it off because, in part, I was probably a little bit daunted by it. From the beginning, it had this incredible reputation as being an amazing read. And I suppose I wanted to do it justice. Um, but yeah, last year, 2025, was the ma year I managed to do that. So, if you're not aware of the storyline, it follows the lives of two London families. One's a working class English family, and the other is a Bangladeshi immigrant family. And the lives of the two families are intertwined and they span across decades and different generations of those two families. In the book itself, it covers themes of race, identity, immigration, and then history, ranging from World War II to the 1990s, and throughout focusing on the struggles of these individuals and the assimilation and multiculturalism that's all interwoven into the book. So I really enjoyed how connected I felt to the various characters. They felt very rounded. The book also elicited laughter, sadness, anger from me, and it asks questions from us: what shapes us and how much choice we have in becoming ourselves, exploring our social locatedness and how that shapes us and the experiences we have. And the characters themselves, they're trying to understand who they are expected to be and who they want to be, which is something that I feel like we're all still doing, sort of going, okay, who are we expected to be? But actually, who is it that we want to be? And how can that come into fruition? And there's definitely a struggle there, isn't there, between those two. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. Also, that deep connection that really comes from living in a society shaped by migration and colonial history, and especially in a time right now when immigration is so often discussed with fear and hostility. White Teeth for me felt like a reminder of how rich, complicated, and alive our shared stories really are. And another thing that struck me was how much humour the book holds. It tackles serious themes. We've got racism, fundamentalism, generational trauma, cultural displacement, but it does it with wit and energy. And I didn't find it superficial. Um, but it did remind me that survival is not only about endurance, but also about joy and creativity. So sometimes it can feel like when we're going through something or even going through something collectively, that there's no space for joy and creativity. But actually, maybe that's when we lean into those a little bit more. Okay, so number 9 is The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and that was published in 2024. I actually chose this book because I have young children, and it did exactly what I wanted it to do. It challenged how I parent and it changed the way I parent. I felt like actually I can't hide behind a sense that my kids will be okay and society is shaped to support children and young people's mental health, even though I know as a set therapist that it's not true. But I almost wanted to be able to give some of that responsibility um, around collectively. But actually, life now feels harder for children than it did when I was growing up, even though in many ways, it's supposed to be safer. But I feel like we've created a world where children are constantly supervised in real life, yet often left alone in the online world. We overparent in physical spaces and underparent in digital ones. And that contradiction feeds into children's anxiety today. We watch them too closely on playgrounds, we manage their schedules, and I'm definitely guilty of all of that. We smooth their conflicts, try and protect them from discomfort, but at the same time, many children navigating social media, online comparison, there's this digital pressure, which is all done without far less guidance or protection than their need. And for me, what this book changed was how I understand safety. I realized that safety is not just about preventing harm, it's also about allowing growth. And that was probably one of the most important takeaways, because I recognize that actually growth requires risk, it requires uncertainty and freedom. And what can happen is that when we don't give our children the chance to fall or to argue or negotiate, be bored, to explore on their own, they miss out on building resilience. They miss out on learning that they can cope, or even believing in themselves. And I've noticed it with my children's school, the way that they are so supervised. They are very, very regulated, which is important, but I find that they're full of rules. And when I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, I remember playing games such as British Bulldog, which was a very physical game, and there'd be 30 kids running from one side of the playground to the other, meeting the other kids and trying to tag each other and knock each other over. And also, I was also walking to school from the age of 8. And at 11 years old, I would take 3 buses, which took over an hour to get to my secondary school. And I can't imagine um, my son or my daughter doing that when they turn 11. I can't imagine me being okay for them to do it, but I, it didn't feel dangerous. I wasn't scared. I was able to understand my boundaries, and it had the opportunity to do that. So I recognize that as a parent, I don't want to parent from a place of fear, whether that's fear that my children will hurt themselves or they will make a mess. I even find that sometimes when they're asking to help cook and bake, there's a part of me going, oh, let me do it because it's going to get really messy. And I have to stop myself and allow them to do it, because otherwise, how are they going to learn to do those things if I can't sit do it for them? How are they going to fail and then build their resilience and get up? So I'm now learning to give them space, within the appropriateness of their ages, and just try and allow them to have a bit more of an expansive world view. My son's 8 now and he's asking to walk to school by himself. It's only a 3-minute walk. There are a couple of roads that have high traffic, because of the station. So I'm sort of allowing him to go further each time, but I'm still there and I'm watching him from a distance. But it's building up his sense of self and his confidence in his decision making, and he'll take his time to look. And even if a car's quite a distance away, he'll still wait before he crosses over. And I think raising emotionally healthy children, it may not mean keeping them safe from everything. It may mean teaching them through experience that they are strong enough to meet the world. Okay, finally, we come to number 10, which is The Art Thief by Michael Frankel, and that was published in 2023. So this is a true story, of Stefan Breitweiser, who is actually one of the most prolific art thieves in history. And over several years, he, along with his girlfriend, who would be lookout, stole hundreds of priceless artworks from small museums and galleries across Europe, and often in broad daylight and without sophisticated tools. A lot of the time, it would be a case of they'd go to an art gallery, see a piece that they wanted and they were coveting, and then they would just look around. If there was no one watching, they would just take it. And what makes this particular story unusual was that the angle wasn't money. Breitweiser, he actually sold because of an obsession and a love for art, and he would keep the pieces hidden in his bedroom in the attic of his mum's home, and he'd treat them as his own private collection. Also, the devastating cultural loss, because what happened was a lot of these artworks were lost or damaged. His mum was trying to hide them from the police that came, after his arrest. So, yeah, it was a real grip of crime and psychology as well as art history. It kept me interested throughout, and the fact that it was a true story really added to it. art became a way for Bright Weiser to build a sense of self, to feel special, to feel alive, which I feel really brings a mirror to what is happening in society at the moment with overconsumption. There's this almost this need to acquire and consume and to elevate how we feel about ourselves. And when I reflect back on my spending habits, that was definitely a big part was to feel better about myself. There was a sense that if I acquired a certain bag or a certain artwork, that I would suddenly be elevated from my life into somebody else's. And it would make me feel better about myself. But then what happens is it's not the truth. You don't get elevated out of your life. You're still living the same life, just with more debt. So I've really had to work on that, what was feeding my spending habits. And a lot of it goes back to not feeling good enough. And I like the fact this book doesn't judge him, but it's not sympathetic either. But it does create space for empathy from me. But at the same time, I noticed I felt quite irritated with his sense of entitlement and his obsession. This book's, for me anyway, it was a great reminder that overconsumption or collection of objects won't complete us. Well, if you've made it this far, thank you so much. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope there's some new books that you may feel called to reading or listening to. And have the most wonderful day wherever you are. Thank you.